President Biden is making his first foreign trip just as his domestic agenda looks increasingly precarious. The White House is turning to Louisiana Republican Senator Bill Cassidy after pulling out of infrastructure talks with Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito, the party's lead negotiator. Senator Cassidy is part of a bipartisan group of senators working on a backup plan. President Biden said he's staying in touch with the group while in Europe. Here's what Senator Capito said about the breakdown in talks with the White House.
I just feel like we've missed a real opportunity here for at least 20 Republicans to join with the other Democrats to pass the most robust infrastructure package that we could have. And I'm still very dedicated to it, and we'll be working through my committees to see that we at least get the legislation to back this up.
While lawmakers struggle to find common ground on infrastructure, Washington is more unified around countering the rise of China. The Senate passed the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act on Tuesday. It's a victory for Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who co-wrote the bill. The sweeping measure aims to combat China's growing global influence by investing nearly $250 billion in American technology and scientific research. The bill now heads to the White House. President Biden touched down in Europe Wednesday for the first in-person G7 summit in 2 years. The so-called 3 Cs will drive much of his meetings: COVID, climate, and China. Here's what he said in a speech at a Royal Air Force base shortly after his arrival.
At every point along the way, we're going to make it clear that the United States is back, and democracies of the world are standing together to tackle the toughest challenges and the issues that matter most to our future. That we're committed to leading with strength, defending our values, and delivering for our people. America is better positioned to advance our national security and our economic prosperity when we bring together like-minded nations to stand with us. These nations that have shed blood alongside of us in defense of our shared values.
And we're learning of a classified directive issued by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, which places Beijing at the center of U.S. defense policy. For more, let's bring in Nicole Killian, Catherine Lucy, and Tyler Pager. Nicole is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Catherine is a White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And Tyler is a White House reporter with the Washington Post. Welcome to all of you. Catherine, let me start with you. Former President Trump sought close relationships with authoritarian leaders like Turkey's President Erdogan and Russian President Putin. What alliances does President Biden aim to shore up?
Elaine, this trip really is about the president trying to rally partners in Europe and other democratic nations. You heard him speak about the importance of democracy. That has been something that has been a theme for him throughout his presidency. And he really wants to try and rally together against what he views as a rise in authoritarianism, at this moment when countries are emerging from the pandemic and those crises. So you're going to see him meeting with a lot of leaders, but that is going to be a key focus for him, especially in these early days of the trip.
Well, Nicole, on infrastructure, is there any reason at all to think that negotiations with Senator Cassidy will be different than with Senator Capito?
Well, I think it's too early to tell, right? I mean, the president is currently out of the country. These talks with Shelley Moore Capito just broke down as of yesterday. And now you do have this bipartisan group of lawmakers that is trying to come up with an alternative. And while they have kind of been operating in the backdrop, they too are still trying to formulate proposals and plans. That's what Senator Cassidy told reporters as much earlier today, that at this point, he is really waiting to bring this draft to a bigger audience before he is ready to formally present something to the White House. So even trying to get something to the White House this week seems like it may or may not happen. So that being said, I think there still is this commitment to try to do infrastructure in a bipartisan way, but clearly this group may need a little bit more time to get a full draft together before it's ready to present to the White House.
Meantime, Tyler, you first reported on the Biden administration's plan to share vaccines after it was criticized for stockpiling them. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so the president and his administration have come to a deal with Pfizer to buy 500 million doses of their coronavirus vaccine to share with the world, particularly low and middle income countries who have struggled to vaccinate their population, especially at a time when the U.S. has vaccinated more than 50% or close to 50% of its own as it works towards meeting President Biden's goal of having 70% of American adults having at least one vaccine by July 4th. This is a deal that the administration has been working on for some time, and the president is expected to announce it this week at the G7 in tandem with the Pfizer CEO as part of this big push that the United States is trying to lead with wealthy countries helping boost global vaccine supply, especially as there is a large disparity in rich countries and poorer countries over the percentages of how many people have received coronavirus vaccines to this point.
You know, Tyler, I'm wondering what you're hearing from public health experts, though, globally, because I know in talking to some physicians, they have felt that there was really an opportunity to do something a lot sooner than now when it comes to that U.S. participation in the global efforts. What is it that you've been hearing?
Absolutely. That has been a criticism of the United States and its leadership for some time. International advocates and organizations working on these issues have pushed the United States to be more aggressive in sharing the vaccines, precisely because the U.S. has been so successful in vaccinating such a large swath of the population, particularly those at most risk. And the disparity has been growing, as some people have used the term vaccine apartheid just to describe the huge difference between low and middle income countries and richer countries. So they're celebrating this announcement, acknowledging that it may be a little later than they would have preferred, and still looking for wealthier countries to do more to ensure that they can get the pandemic under control around the world.
Right, because we know that those disparities between countries really is quite vast when you look at specific situations. Catherine, on another topic here, the White House is revoking the former Trump administration's ban on downloading TikTok, WeChat, and other Chinese-owned apps. How will they address potential security risks?
You know, I know that's something they are trying to address. There's concerns about security, but they have, rolled that back. This comes obviously as they've, broadly reviewed a lot of Trump policies, in the first part of this administration, and they're trying to deal with issues around cybersecurity and coping with, privacy and those issues. So I think we'll have to see how that unfolds, but certainly they are aware of those concerns.
Yeah, it's something that we'll be watching for, especially given, all these concerns around cybersecurity lately. Nicole, is there any sign that Democrats will consider bending their legislative proposals towards Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema in order to get things done?
Not necessarily, especially because there has been a strong clamoring from progressives to keep a lot of this legislation either intact or as bold as possible. So on the issue of voting rights, of course, we do expect Senate Democrats to move forward with putting that on the Senate floor later this month, even though Joe Manchin has been clear about his opposition to it. There has been some talk about potentially breaking up parts of that legislation. We do know that Senator Manchin is supportive of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but just yesterday we heard Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell kind of pour cold water, saying that he opposes that and he doesn't think that legislation is necessary. But that is kind of a narrower, more targeted bill that would strengthen federal voting rights legislation. So that is something that does have broad support both in the House and potentially in the Senate, assuming enough Republicans come on board. On infrastructure, look, like I said, there is quite a wide gulf between the Manchins of the world and the progressives of the party, and because of the narrow margin that Democrats have in both chambers, it really is going to be very difficult to satisfy all aspects of the party. We do know that Democrats potentially are prepared to move forward with reconciliation. I was just talking to House Budget Chairman John Yarmuth earlier today, who said that really is his understanding, is that a reconciliation will likely be the course of action to try to move through with the American Families Plan the American Jobs Plan, and that if some kind of infrastructure deal is struck, that maybe that part will be parceled out of a reconciliation package. He did say what many Democrats have been saying is that ideally they want to do this in a bipartisan fashion, which is something that Joe Manchin has been calling for. But again, we know these negotiations have been very tenuous, and the time really is running out. You know, the White House would like to get something done by this summer. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has expressed, July 4th is really a marker on infrastructure. So again, these next couple of days and weeks will really be pivotal to see kind of which direction all of this legislation goes.
Right. When you look at the calendar, there really is not very much time left to hammer out a deal. Finally, Tyler, a comprehensive report on the Capitol riot released Tuesday mentioned nothing about why supporters of the former president stormed the Capitol, nor the role Mr. Trump may have played. A new Politico Morning Consult poll shows nearly a third of Republicans believe the former president will be somehow reinstated. Tyler, how is what happened on January 6th impacting bipartisan relations?
I think there's no question that the events of January 6th have fundamentally changed relations for a lot of members on the Hill who were there when the mob stormed the Capitol, and many of them felt their lives were in danger. And for some of those members, the Republicans who voted against the commission to study what happened on January 6th, who continued to deny the role that Republican leaders, including former President Donald Trump, played in those events, I think it has made bipartisanship a lot harder, especially for those on opposite ends of the party. So the most conservative members of the Republican Party and the most progressive members of the Democratic Party. There's been a lot of tension between them, and really difficult for a lot of them to move forward working together. Though, Washington has not been necessarily known for a lot of bipartisan action in the last few years. I think this has cemented a lot of those barriers to working across the aisle. I think we're seeing a little bit more of success in the Senate, at least attempting to do bipartisan negotiations, as we've seen with this group working on infrastructure. But in terms of a lot of bipartisan action, I think that the events of January 6th and the fallout of not passing this commission have torpedoed those efforts, no doubt about it.
Yeah, I mean, this just feels so much different than policy disagreements or past political differences. Something does feel, as you say, quite different about this atmosphere that we're in right now. Nicole Killian, Catherine Lucy, and Tyler Pager, thanks to you all. Really appreciate it.